Europe is rearming. In what's being called a historic turning point, the European Commission has unveiled an 800 billion euros plan to strengthen the continent's defense capabilities. It's a move that signals a response not just to threats from Russia, but also to a shifting transatlantic relationship under the Trump administration. Europe is being pushed to stand on its own. But is this a genuine break from the past? Can Europe build the kind of military and political autonomy to match other great powers? And what does all of this mean for NATO, for US global leadership, and for the values that have long bound Western democracies together? To unpack this, I am joined by Kori Schake, a former foreign policy advisor to President George W. Bush and now Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, and by Bruno Oliveira Martins, senior researcher here at PRIO and expert on European foreign and security policy. I am Arnaud Siad, and this is PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Kori, Bruno, welcome to this episode.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
So let's start with this 800 billion euros defense plan unveiled by the European Commission. Bruno, is this truly a seismic shift in Europe's security architecture? In terms of scale, would Europe essentially double its military capacities?
This issue of translating specific numbers and specific funds into actual specific capabilities, it's always a bit difficult. So in terms of a big shift, it's certainly a very big shift, not only in what it means in practice and what it translates to, but also in the broader political context. So we're talking here about kind of two initiatives that the European Commission launched in late March that basically will come and add to many other initiatives that were taken, since February 2022. Here we're talking about the ReArm program, which is kind of a set of measures trying to create the conditions for rearmament in Europe. This is kind of the language that is explicitly used. And we're also talking about the white paper on European defense presented in close collaboration with this. So basically here, these are a set of measures that aim at kind of closing the gap between Europe and other countries by creating a set of specific financial programs that enable European countries to have access to new funding for military issues. It's also important to emphasize that this happens together with specific national initiatives that the different countries in Europe have. So and having access to funds alleviated and facilitated by the European Commission is not the only way by which European countries will be spending money on military issues. So we're talking about kind of a completely different landscape in Europe when it comes to issues of security and defense. When it comes to whether or not this 800 billion will kind of double the capacity, that's a different discussion. So together with colleagues Nick Marsh and Jocelyn Maudsley, we have been doing some work on the challenges that come when you inject a lot of funding into military and defense programs without having a common set of priorities, etc. So kind of there are many risks that come with the simple fact that you bring a lot of funding into security and defense issues. And that does not automatically translate into more capability. So kind of that is a discussion that comes afterwards.
Bruno, you've said closing the gap. And in that same vein, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk said about the plan that Europe will arm itself more wisely and faster than Russia. So if you can compare it to the US, China, Russia, if Europe delivers on this, can it essentially compete with other well-armed great powers? And is that even the plan?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you bring up the example of a Polish politician, because perceptions in Europe they really differ from country to country. So kind of obviously Poland and the Baltic states have a very acute sense of emergency when it comes to threats that is not necessarily shared by all European countries, and that's interesting and worth noting. So kind of this is something that is part of the political discussion surrounding European defense. I would say that the plan is not necessarily to compete with big powers, but is actually to have a credible deterrence capacity, which is something that at the moment, without the US security umbrella, does not exist in Europe. That's my very clear opinion and assumption. And then, of course, if the deterrence logic doesn't work, then the capacity to defend itself. I think that the logic of competition and arms race is something that is not common to all European countries, except perhaps when it comes to disruptive technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, where the logic is a logic of competition and a logic of race. And the idea is that if Europe lags behind, then it will never be able to close the gap properly. So kind of, and this is obviously related to the dual use character of some of these disruptive technologies that are understood to have a kind of a broader impact on society beyond the military. So kind of, I think that the logic of competition exists in some domains, but not in all domains.
Kori, it seems that what prompted the EU Commission to make this big announcement on defense is a shift by the US administration on its relationship with Europe. We recall US Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich conference last February, where he attacked Europe over its liberal values, free speech, immigration. He said the greatest threat facing Europe was not from Russia and China, but from within, and that Europe must step up in a big way to provide for its own defense. So, what did you make of that speech? What does it mean for the transatlantic alliance?
So the speech was dangerous, extremist nonsense, and it's had really damaging effects because not only do America's closest friends in the world question whether we would help protect them if they were attacked, they actually worry that we are on the enemy's side and a danger to them. And that is the destruction of 80 years of trust and cooperation across the Atlantic. So I think Europeans are quite right to be frightened by what Trump and Vance portend for at least as long as the United States Congress permits them to do so. And Europeans are smart to think about, to see the way that the Trump administration not just abandoned Ukraine, but shut off intelligence sharing, shut off promised weapons deliveries in ways that Europeans should fear a Trump administration might do to them. And so I think it's quite sensible for Europeans to think about how, if the United States does to us what it did to Ukraine, how do we ensure that we are not at risk of our territory and our people being attacked?
And Kori, you are a Republican. You served as a foreign policy
Yeah.
advisor. You served as foreign policy advisor to President George W. Bush, and you played a key role in NATO's modernization during his administration. I think you're the perfect person to ask how you reconcile today's Republican rhetoric about Europe, with leaders like J.D. Vance calling Europe the problem, with the transatlantic commitment that defined the Republican Party's foreign policy when you were in government.
Yeah. So I don't attempt to reconcile it. It is what they are doing is destructive and dangerous, not just to our European allies, but to the United States itself. And so we're in the midst of a big fight about the nature of conservatism in America. And I actually think I and traditional Republican conservatives have much better answers, much cheaper, more effective answers for sustaining America's security and prosperity than President Trump and Vice President Vance and their enablers in the government are providing. And I think at the 100-day point, Americans begin to agree with me.
You're perhaps referring to some of the polling done by the New York Times. I wonder if it's even helpful to frame it as a Republican versus Democrat issue. The reality is that this American pivot away from Europe started before Trump. The administration of President Barack Obama announced a pivot to Asia in November 2011 already. Obama talked of the US as a Pacific nation in relation to its west coast on the Pacific Ocean. Is it fair to say that this shift has been a long time coming and that Europe had plenty of warnings?
I think that overstates the case a little bit, Arnaud, because the Obama administration regretted using the word pivot. And they tried to walk it back, but of course, uh, that kind of clumsiness was characteristic of the Obama White House. I mean, remember leading from behind. Um, and what they were actually trying to do was continue what the George W. Bush administration had done, which is rebalance our forces toward the threats emergent in the Pacific. So, not abandoning our European allies, but acknowledging that the threats in Europe had diminished at that time, and European capacity was enormous relative to the threats it was facing. And so, to the extent there were warnings, I mean, American administrations have been pleading with Europeans to do more for their own defense my entire professional life. And Europeans mostly didn't. And I think that it doesn't justify the behavior of Trump and Vance and others, but it did leave space for average Americans to think, why don't Europeans do more for their own defense? That's a sensible request.
And it seems at the very least that some European leaders saw some sort of warnings coming from the US. I mean, Bruno, we recall French President Emmanuel Macron describing NATO as brain dead in a famous article in The Economist in 2019 during the first Trump administration. He said America is turning its back on Europe and that on defense, Europe was standing on the edge of a precipice. So it seems like Macron's push for what he has called the strategic autonomy of Europe has fallen on deaf ears. And could you tell us, Bruno, why it has been challenging, if not impossible, to come up with a cohesive, common defense policy in Europe to match the political and economic integration that we've seen on the continent?
Yeah, it's a very interesting way to putting it, and I also think it's very relevant that we are having a that we are discussing issues regarding European security and defense with with a very close connection with the American context, because these things are really fundamentally intertwined. The issue of European defense has been a taboo in Europe for many decades, and it's really interesting to try to understand first why it happened, but also the consequences of that taboo, and some of those consequences we are discussing now. Precisely, the fundamental dependence on the US, and the incapacity for Europe to present a credible deterrence dimension to its policies. And this can be traced back to the 1950s. And I think that many decades have gone since that. And I think that a lot of people have forgotten about it. And it's very interesting to bring it up. So kind of when the project of European integration started after the Second World War, very much pushed by the US Marshall Plan, we had kind of the three founding treaties that triggered the European integration process, and those were the treaty creating Euratom, the treaty creating the European coal and steel community, and the treaty establishing the European Economic Community. and those were signed and entered into force in the 50s. But there was a fourth one that people have forgotten about, and that was the treaty establishing the European Defense Community. And this was a treaty that created a security and defense pillar within the nascent European integration projects. Created something akin to a European army, something akin to a European defense minister. So kind of this was hardcore security and defense and military dimension to the projects. But the treaty was signed in 1952. And then, according to the normal logics, it would have to be ratified, in the 6 parliaments of the countries that were, signing that treaty, which were the 6 founding members of the European integration. So, kind of the members that signed the other 3 were also signing this one. But then, kind of the geopolitical situation changed. There was kind of some appeasement in the Korean War. Stalin died, etc. And so kind of the sense of emergency declined a little bit. And there were kind of fears about, what the treaty would do when it comes to the national sovereignty of some European countries when it comes to issues of security and defense. And then the ratification failed in the French National Assembly in August 1954. And this created a huge taboo because this was the first setback of all the different projects of integration and cooperation post Second World War in Europe. This created a huge taboo when it comes to security and defense. So basically the result of it was, okay, from this moment onwards, if European integration is to proceed and is to develop, it cannot deal with issues of defense, because that will basically stall all the discussions and bring about a lot of problems. And so from that moment onwards, the European integration process focused on something else, and then decades went by, and basically, other initiatives tried to, in a sense, make up for this. But the real transformation only started, in February 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine again.
It's quite the contrast in the French sort of approach to European defense from what you said until Macron today. And Kori, as we mentioned the French, and being French myself, I feel like we've been here before in the European US rift. There was that famous UN Security Council showdown in early 2003, where French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin gave his widely praised, at least in Europe, speech opposing military action against Iraq, which the Bush administration, for whom you were working, was supporting, and a strong wave of anti-French sentiment across parts of the United States. I remember I was young then, but there was, the renaming of French fries into freedom fries and etc. And also we're seeing today a sort of call for boycotting of US brands here on this side. So, Kori, how does today's rift compare to that moment? Is this a deeper break, or is it another rough patch that the transatlantic alliance can weather?
So I would start where Bruno did with the European defense community, although I think he elided over the major reason that the French refused to ratify the treaty, which was a refusal to support German rearmament. That was overt at the time, and the Eisenhower administration had threatened an agonizing reappraisal of American commitment to Europe unless Europeans agreed to German rearmament, which the American administration believed was essential to deterring Soviet aggression. What is different, I think, between now and then is that the Eisenhower administration was never going to abandon Europe. Whereas, if I were the NATO Secretary General, I would feign a heart attack, get hospitalized, and cancel the NATO summit scheduled for this summer, because I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the Trump administration use that moment and that venue to announce the withdrawal of US troops from Europe. And I do think the Trump administration is a genuine outlier, and it makes this moment more difficult than dangerous than the typical, France withdrawing from the Integrated Military Command and throwing the NATO headquarters and U.S. troops out of France, or the Franco-German core proposals of the 1990s that would have taken Germany out of the NATO Integrated Military Command for the first time. This is more serious because you have an American president who genuinely does not believe allies are advantageous to the United States, and who is fundamentally incapable of trying to imagine just how much everything the United States does in the world is enabled by the cooperation of America's friends. You can't get an American army division to the Middle East without the ports of Antwerp and Hamburg. You can't get American troops to the Pacific without the government of Panama not only letting us transit the canal, but giving us priority for transit in the canal, which they have always done. So the Trump administration is, I fear, going to give us all a very expensive education on just how hard it is for the United States to achieve anything in the world without help.
And as a sign, perhaps, of how perilous things are at the moment, there's been questions growing in Europe by experts and some politicians about using US-made weapon systems or platforms, particularly advanced military hardware, that remain dependent on US infrastructure or approval to operate fully.
I think those are absolutely justified. And Europeans are right to suggest that they need to shield themselves against erratic behavior by the administration. And in my judgment, it's going to take a generation to restore the trust that President Trump and his team are burning through. The only potential positive comment I would make is that one of the things Russia's invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated for all of us is that all of our militaries need to rebuild the defense industrial base. The cupboards are bare for all of us having the munitions and weapon systems to fight at the intensity Ukraine has been fighting. And so almost every Western defense industry improvement is not only good for Europe, it's good for the United States as well.
And in terms of what's good for Europe, Bruno, you co-wrote a policy briefing to the European Parliament last summer on EU security and defense policy. Can you tell us what your recommendations were?
Yeah, so this was a study that was commissioned by the European Parliament to get input on issues regarding security and defense technologies. And this was co-authored by my colleague Raluca Xernatoni at Carnegie Europe and myself. And we basically looked at at issues and challenges and opportunities in the European landscape, but also in the context of geopolitical competition when it comes to disruptive technologies. And basically, we have a number of recommendations, and I think that I don't have time to go through all of that, but we maybe I would highlight three. So one has to do with the importance of fostering trust and cooperation with academia and the industry. So armies cannot and there is a general awareness of this that military innovation does not happen in military silos anymore, and this is something that really emerges mostly in civilian contexts that then it needs to transfer into the military sphere. So the second one is that because of the very big potential for societal impact of some of these technologies, further engagement with issues of security and defense, particularly when it comes to new technologies, needs to have democratic legitimacy. And so Having the involvement of the European Parliament is really crucial, but it's not sufficient. National parliaments really need to foster those debates, and I think that we are not there yet. I think that when it comes to really bringing these discussions to the national political level, I think that there's still quite a lot of work to do. And then the final one is that if there is to be a push for the integration of new technologies in military contexts, as it seems to be the way in many areas of the planet, if Europe wants to jump on that train as well, then this needs to be matched with an equal commitment to international regulation and governance of this new technology, technology transfer, ethical use, etc. And so kind of we cannot have a push for use of new technologies without the same commitment to actually regulate this use.
And I'd like to ask you, Bruno, about a key player in all of this, which is Germany. Obviously, Germany has dragged its feet for a long time on European defense specifically, but now we're about to enter a new era with Friedrich Merz, who is expected to become Germany's next chancellor very soon now. And he said that the country will pour hundreds of billions of euros in extra spending on defense and infrastructure. He said, in view of the threats to our freedom and peace on our continent, the rule for our defense now has to be whatever it takes. And he's linked this to the recent decisions by the American government. So, Bruno, what will Germany's shift mean for Europe's overall ability to defend itself and for the future of European security? I mean, we're talking about the largest economy in Europe here.
Yeah, obviously, and to Kori's point before, Germany is obviously a key actor in or potentially a key actor on issues of security and defense if Europe wants to be seen as a credible defense actor. So there's no other way around it. And the taboo that emerged, out of the failure of the European defense community is very much, it had an implication on kind of, or it has a German dimension to it. So kind of overcoming the taboo of European defense implies overcoming the taboo of the German rearmament. I think this is quite clear. And so kind of Germany as a key economy in Europe, cannot be excluded, from processes that aim at expanding the EU commitment to issues of security and defense. And so this is in itself a huge development, at the kind of at the political geostrategic level. This is huge, and this has very big implications also when it comes to the nature of the European project, as a peace project. That was the logic of European integration. And as a European that is a product of the post-Cold War geopolitical environment, I would be very happy if Europe would be able to continue to focus on non-military issues. But as a security studies researcher, looking at the geopolitical situation that I see today, looking at kind of at the very large transformations that have been triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I think it's unfortunately inevitable that we have these discussions and that we see Europe and Germany gearing towards this. This leaves me certainly a little bit unsettled. We are also in an area of nationalism and the resurgent logics of nationalism, which coupled with issues of rearmament is certainly a bit disturbing. But the situation is very complex, and it needs to be addressed as a multi-layered, very complex situation.
As we wrap this episode, Kori, I want to ask you about the values that underpin what we're discussing today on defense and security. As we mark the third anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine last February, the US sided twice with Russia at the United Nations. The first time, the US opposed the European drafted resolution at the General Assembly, and in doing so, it voted quite remarkably the same way as Russia and countries like North Korea and Belarus, not countries we usually associate with the US on global affairs. The second time, the US drafted and voted for a resolution at the Security Council which called for an end to the conflict but contained no criticism of Russia. And France and the UK, they basically abstain from voting that resolution. So, quite the shift at the United Nations, where the Western alliance doesn't really look like an alliance anymore. So, Kori, is this shift at the United Nations just a Trump era phenomenon, or does it reflect a deeper, lasting change in American values that could fundamentally reshape the US relationship with Europe?
So it is both my hope and my belief that it's a temporary phenomenon. I would add to your list of disgraces that the Trump administration twice refused to sign up to a G7 communique that criticized Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So it's not just at the United Nations that we're confronting this problem. What I know from the first Trump term is that in 2016, his three fundamental beliefs that allies were taking advantage of the United States, that trade was taking American jobs, and that immigrants were taking American jobs. Those were reasonably popular propositions, right? That's what helped get him elected. Within 2 years, the public soured on all three, on their own support for all three of those issues. And it is now the case that Americans are very worried about how alone we feel absent our closest friends. Americans have more support for trade as beneficial to my family than has ever been recorded. So I think we are already seeing the American public, who has the luxury of paying very little attention to the world, because we won the geopolitical lottery by getting Mexico and Canada as our next door neighbors. And you see Americans watching what the president's doing. I mean, the president now has the lowest approval rating of any American president in 80 years, the lowest recorded at 39% support. And those polls are before the effects of tariff craziness have hit the American economy. So I think we are already seeing a public in the United States saying, wait a minute, I thought I was voting for less economic regulation and, an end of democratic leftism on social issues. That's not what they're seeing. The only policy President Trump is enacting that has public support is on deportations of criminal illegal immigrants. That's it. And even there, both the courts and the public want a judicial process to determine the appropriateness of it.
Kori, Bruno, thank you very much.
It was such a pleasure, Arnaud, and a treat to learn from you, Bruno.
Thanks so much, and likewise.